The air in the cabin was thick with the heat of summer, a heavy, humid blanket that clung to everything. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, leaving only the moon to light the woods around us. It had been a long day at Camp Old Indian, a Boy Scout camp tucked away in the dense woods of upstate South Carolina. We'd been on the water all day, working on badges, canoeing, swimming, learning about water safety, and by the time we were back at the camp, we were all completely wiped out. I remember stumbling into the cabin, my legs sore from paddling, my body yearning for rest. The open-sided cabin we were staying in had a rustic, almost eerie feel to it. The wood creaked in the quiet of the night, and the forest outside seemed alive with 1,000 sounds. The wind rustling through the trees, insects chirping, the occasional crack of a twig under the weight of some unseen animal. But tonight, the forest felt different. It was too quiet, and for some reason, that unsettled me. The cabin had a row of bunk beds, all of them lined up along the walls. I was on the bottom bunk, trying to get some sleep. It was one of those rare moments in life when everything aligns, and you're both physically and mentally exhausted enough to drift into a deep sleep. My troopmates were scattered around the room, snoring, their bodies sprawled out in their sleeping bags. The air smelled like campfire smoke, mixed with the scent of pine and the damp earth outside. I did what any 12-year-old boy would do when alone in a dark, remote cabin with no one else watching. I took a moment for myself. I didn't think much of it. Just a quick, private release, a way to make the night pass faster, I suppose. I rolled over afterward, sinking into the fabric of my sleeping bag. My eyelids fluttered closed, and the quiet rhythm of the night lulled me into a deep sleep. But sleep doesn't always last. Sometimes it's interrupted by that nagging sense of something wrong. I woke up, slowly, feeling the strange heaviness in the air. My mind was groggy, but I immediately knew something wasn't right. There was a stillness around me, a profound quiet. The usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, like someone had pressed the pause button on the world outside. It was the kind of silence that pricked at your skin, the kind that sets off alarm bells in the back of your mind. I lay there, my eyes cracked open, trying to make sense of it. The moonlight poured through the open sides of the cabin, casting long, pale beams of light across the floor. I blinked a few times, trying to adjust my eyes. The light shimmered off the pine needles outside, but there was something different about the way it fell, something that felt off. That's when I saw them. At first, it was just a pair of glowing yellow eyes, staring at me through the forest. They seemed to float just outside the edge of the beam of moonlight, the only thing visible in the otherwise pitch-black woods. My heart skipped in my chest. I could feel the blood drain from my face as my eyes locked onto the eyes of whatever was watching me. They weren't the eyes of a deer or a possum or anything else I'd seen around the camp. No, these were the eyes of a predator. There was no mistaking it. They were calculating, cold, intelligent eyes. They held me in place, as if they were measuring me, trying to figure me out. My breathing hitched, and my pulse started to race. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to move, to jump up and scream for help, but I didn't. The one thing I knew for sure was that if I panicked, if I showed any sign of fear, the animal out there would know. It would smell it, sense it. Wolves, like other predators, could pick up on that. And that thought alone made me freeze. I had to stay still. I had to keep my composure. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, I saw more. They were there, scattered around the cabin, hidden in the dark, watching. At least 8 sets of eyes, all glowing yellow in the moonlight. My breath caught in my throat. I could hear the leaves rustling softly around the cabin, the faintest sound of paws padding softly over the forest floor, moving closer, circling. Wolves. I had heard stories from older scouts about wolves in these woods, though it was rare to see them. They had their territory and we had ours. But tonight, those lines felt blurred. I tried to calm my breathing, willing myself to be as quiet as possible. I couldn't risk making any noise. The wolves didn't make a sound, not a single growl or bark, but I could feel them out there. They were waiting. I counted the pairs of eyes again, 8. It felt like they were closing in, slowly surrounding the cabin, but they didn't rush in. They took their time, almost as if they were toying with me. I was no longer sure whether I was in control of the situation. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to wake my troopmates, to do anything to make the situation feel less dire. But I couldn't. The pack was too close, too silent. The air felt thick and heavy, the forest holding its breath, and I, too, held mine. Every little movement felt like it would betray me. I couldn't even bring myself to move my head. The eyes just kept watching, waiting. I wasn't sure how much time had passed. Minutes? Hours? Felt like an eternity. My body was frozen, stiff with fear, yet every part of me screamed for action. But I knew I had to stay still. I had to wait it out. Wolves are opportunistic hunters. They prey on the weak, the vulnerable. I couldn't give them that. I couldn't be the one they chose. And then, as if they had reached some sort of unspoken agreement, the eyes started to fade. One by one, the wolves turned, silently vanishing back into the darkness of the forest. It was like they had never been there at all. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my hands clammy, but the silence that followed their departure felt almost worse. Had they gone? Or had they just moved out of range, watching from somewhere I couldn't see? My thoughts were a blur, but the tension in my chest didn't ease. The moonlight seemed to stretch across the ground in the same gentle way as before, but I couldn't trust it anymore. The night no longer felt peaceful, felt ominous. I waited a long time, still wide awake, still unsure whether I had really seen what I thought I had. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Was it my fear making things worse than they were? But then the thought came back to me. There was nothing stopping them. Nothing to prevent the pack from attacking, from tearing into us while we slept. But they hadn't. For some reason, they'd left. And I didn't understand why. The other boys in my troop slept soundly around me, oblivious to the danger just outside the cabin walls. I envied them their peaceful slumber, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there for what felt like hours, my mind racing, every little noise from the forest sending a jolt through my body. The slightest rustle, the crack of a twig. It could be them again, couldn't it? Eventually, exhaustion took over. My eyes fluttered shut, and I drifted off into a fitful sleep, but it wasn't the deep, restful sleep I had hoped for. Every sound from the forest had me jumping awake, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a restless night, filled with strange dreams and anxious thoughts. By morning, the sunlight filtered through the trees, and the air outside was thick with the scent of pine and fresh earth. The cabin was alive with the sounds of the camp, boys talking, laughing, and getting ready for another day of activities. But for me, the world felt different. The sense of unease lingered in the pit of my stomach. I hadn't told anyone what I had seen. What could I have said? No one would have believed me. It seemed so absurd, so unbelievable. Wolves outside the cabin, just watching us, waiting. It was something that I would carry with me for years, a secret I kept to myself, one that haunted me every time I found myself alone in the woods. But as I stood there, the early morning light spilling into the cabin, I realized something. The wolves had left. They could have attacked, could have done anything they wanted, but they didn't. They simply watched, calculated, and then disappeared. And that, I think, was the most terrifying part of it all. They didn't need to attack. They didn't need to make a move. Their presence was enough to make me question everything. The world wasn't as safe as I had thought. And in the woods, there was always something watching. It was the first week of summer camp, and we were in the thick of a busy schedule. The days were packed with activities: swimming, archery, arts and crafts, and of course, hiking. As a camp counselor, I was used to leading kids through the woods. It wasn't my first summer on staff, so I had a pretty good handle on the routes, what to expect, and how to keep the kids in line. The highlight of the week was always the hike to MT Everest, a huge mud hill that the kids adored climbing. They'd scramble up it, getting filthy, but the joy they got from reaching the top and yelling, "I made it," was worth every bit of the mess. It was a rite of passage at camp, and every camper looked forward to it. We had about 20 kids with us on this hike, ranging from 8 to 13 years old. They were all eager, chattering excitedly as we set off on the trail, eager to tackle the infamous MT Everest. The sun was shining, and there was just a slight breeze, perfect weather for a day out in the woods. I'd been working at the camp for a couple of years, and every time we did this hike, it felt like it was going to be just like the last one. But this one, it turned out, would be anything but routine. As we neared the base of MT Everest, I noticed that the nature director, Terry, was a little farther ahead of us than usual. He was always ahead of the group by a bit, scouting the trail and making sure everything was safe, but this time he was well beyond the normal distance. He was about 50 to 100 feet ahead, which made me raise an eyebrow. That wasn't normal. Terry's voice rang out through the trees. "Stop! Hold up, everybody!" He called back to us, his tone sharp and urgent. "Everyone, take the alternate trail to the left. Now!" Confused, I signaled for the kids to halt. "All right, everyone, we're going this way," I said, guiding the campers off the main path and toward a less familiar trail. They all grumbled a bit, disappointed to be changing plans, but they followed along. I didn't like the way Terry had called out. It wasn't his usual calm, steady voice. There was something more frantic about it, something that put me on edge. As the kids followed me down the new path, I made eye contact with a few of the other counselors, silently asking if they had any idea what was going on. They just shrugged, clearly as confused as I was. We made it a few hundred yards before I noticed that Terry had doubled back and was coming toward us. His face was pale, eyes wide with a kind of unsettled energy that didn't sit right with me. When he reached me, he quickly pulled me aside. "You need to get the kids out of here," he said in a low voice, glancing over his shoulder like he was making sure no one was listening. "We found a body." I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "A body?" I asked, though I could tell by the look on his face that he wasn't joking. "Where?" Terry hesitated for a moment. "At the base of MT Everest. I think the man had been there for a couple of days, maybe. It's not good. It's bad. It's bad, man." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. We were miles into the woods, about 10 miles from the camp itself, so it made sense that it hadn't been found sooner. But I had never expected to hear something like that on a simple hike. It was a lot to take in, and my first instinct was to get the kids out of there, fast. I quickly signaled for the group to stop and told the kids we needed to turn around. There was no way we were going anywhere near MT Everest now. They grumbled, but no one questioned me. I glanced back at Terry, who was already moving ahead, clearly needing to check on something else. His eyes were still wide, and his hand was slightly shaking as he pulled out his radio to call in the camp director. We rerouted the hike entirely, taking the kids down a different trail that looped around the base of the hill. As we walked, I kept my eyes on the kids, trying to keep them distracted with stories and jokes, but my mind kept drifting back to what Terry had said. A body? In the woods? That wasn't something I was prepared for. When we got back to camp, the atmosphere was different. There was an uneasy tension in the air that wasn't there before. The camp director, Linda, was in the main office with Terry, and I could see they were talking seriously. A few of the other counselors had gathered around, whispering among themselves. No one seemed sure how to handle the situation. Later that afternoon, Linda called a meeting with all the counselors, telling us to keep things calm and not to mention anything about the body to the campers. We were to tell them that there had been an accident, and that we were simply keeping them away from the area for their safety. It was a tough decision, but it made sense. We couldn't risk causing a panic among the kids, not with everything else we had going on at camp. That evening, after dinner, the camp held a small prayer vigil for the man who had died. We didn't know his name, but Linda explained that he had clearly been suffering and had taken his life. She led a brief prayer for him and for anyone who might be struggling with similar feelings. It was a somber moment, and the kids were respectful, even though they didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. As for me, I couldn't shake the image of the body from my mind. Even though we were told not to speak of it, I kept thinking about what it must have been like for that man. He had been alone in the woods, no one to help him, no one to notice him, just the cold, silent trees. I didn't know what had led him to that point, but I couldn't imagine how terrifying it must have been, to feel so isolated. But somehow, the experience didn't end there. The next day, we took the campers out again for a different hike. It was a shorter one, just around the camp, but it still had that same feeling of unease in the air. As I led the kids down the trail, I started to think about how I could use what happened to make the campfire stories a little more interesting. I'd always been the one to tell the scariest stories, the ones that got the kids to jump and look over their shoulders as the fire crackled behind me. But after what had happened, I had a new inspiration, something real, something they'd never forget. That night, as we sat around the fire, I began telling a story about the woods. I told them about a man who had come to the camp, lost and alone. He'd wandered deep into the woods, looking for something he couldn't find, until one day, he disappeared. His body was found at the base of a great hill, like a great mud mountain, surrounded by the trees. The wind would whisper through the branches, carrying his spirit, and sometimes, if you were unlucky, you'd hear him calling out for help. The kids were all wide-eyed, hanging on every word. I could see the fear on their faces, and I couldn't help but enjoy it a little. The story was just wild enough to keep them on edge, but not too real to scare them into being afraid of the woods. And it had a twist, one that was true but also felt like fiction. The man who had wandered too far. The man who couldn't find his way back. Over the course of the summer, I started to weave this story into the nightly campfire rituals. The kids loved it. I could tell they were nervous every time we went on a hike after that. Some of them even brought it up to me, asking if I thought the spirit of the man still roamed the woods, and I'd just shrug and give a cryptic answer. In a way, it felt good to make them feel something real. Not supernatural, not magical, just the raw, harsh reality of the wilderness. The idea that we were all just one wrong turn away from being lost. One bad decision away from something much worse. By the end of the summer, the story had taken on a life of its own. But what was more surprising was that the campers didn't seem to mind. They enjoyed the fear, the suspense, the idea that they were part of something bigger than just the usual camp activities. It felt like they had experienced something they couldn't forget. And in some ways, I think I had too. Because every time I walked those trails, every time I looked out at the forest, I couldn't help but wonder if the man's spirit was still out there. But not in a way that made me afraid. No, it was more like a reminder of how fragile life could be, how easy it was to get lost in the woods, and how sometimes the woods kept secrets. That summer, we had our fair share of ghost stories and tall tales, but none of them ever seemed as real as the one I told the kids. And for some reason, none of us ever really spoke about it again after that. We all just carried it with us, a quiet truth that lived in the background of every hike, every campfire, and every shadow in the woods. The woods had their stories, and sometimes they weren't the kind that could be explained away. They were just there. It was supposed to be just another weekend trip, just me and a couple of my friends. We had decided to head out to a camping spot we had been to before, a quiet patch of forest nestled by a stream. The weather was perfect, clear skies, warm afternoons, and crisp nights. I knew the area, had hiked through it a few times, and the thought of getting away from everything for a couple of days felt like exactly what I needed. No distractions, no work, no responsibilities. We made the drive out on a Friday evening, arriving as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The campsite was remote enough that we didn't see anyone else, just the sound of the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional bird call. We set up our tents along the bank of the stream, unloading our gear and cracking open a few cold beers to enjoy the night. Everything felt calm, serene, but that night something felt off. The first sign that things weren't right happened after we ate. We sat around the fire, talking about old stories and laughing. But as the night deepened, I noticed a strange silence settling around us. No crickets, no owls. The wind had stilled, the kind of quiet that made your ears ring. I shook it off as just being the nature of the forest at night. The fire crackled and popped, casting long shadows that danced around the clearing. We all went to bed fairly early, a few of us in the tents, the others in hammocks, settling down to sleep with the soft sound of the stream as our lullaby. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept tossing and turning, waking up every hour or so. Restless. It wasn't the kind of feeling you get from a bad dream, just a weird unease. Something deep in my gut told me that I wasn't alone out there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I brushed it off as just the typical paranoia of being in the woods. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it. A noise. At first, I thought it was just the sound of a deer or some other animal walking through the woods. But then I heard it again. It was soft but unmistakable. The sound of something heavy moving in the brush. Something large. I lay still, listening, trying to convince myself it was just a raccoon or maybe a wild boar. But it didn't stop. It was moving slowly, deliberately. I waited, holding my breath, hoping it would just pass. But it didn't. It got closer. I lay in the dark, barely breathing, straining to hear anything that would tell me what it was. My mind raced, my stomach twisted. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing, but the noise was so distinct, so intentional it couldn't be ignored. The hairs on my neck prickled as I lay there, frozen in place, listening to the crunch of leaves and twigs. It was like whatever it was knew exactly where we were. I grabbed my flashlight from the side of my tent, my hands shaking as I flicked it on. For a second, I just lay there, too terrified to do anything. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but all I could see were the trees, the shadowy forms of branches swaying gently in the breeze. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly unzipped the tent and crept outside, careful not to make a sound. The light moved over the clearing, scanning the woods around us. Nothing, just the silent woods, still as death. My breathing was the only sound I could hear, and it felt unnaturally loud. I stood there for a few minutes, waiting, straining to hear anything. Then I saw it. A movement, a shape darting behind a tree, just at the edge of the clearing. It was quick, too quick. My flashlight snapped toward it, but all I saw was a flicker of dark fur and then nothing. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. My heart hammered in my chest as I slowly made my way back to the fire. Every step measured, every movement slow and deliberate. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. I didn't hear anything else, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. The next morning, the others were awake, laughing and joking around the campfire, none of them mentioning anything unusual. They all seemed perfectly fine, like nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, half expecting to see something lurking there. We spent the day hiking, enjoying the beauty of the place, but that uneasy feeling never left me. It lingered in the back of my mind, creeping into every quiet moment. That night, I was determined to get some sleep. The others didn't seem bothered by the weirdness of the previous night, and I figured I was just being paranoid. But as the sun set and we sat around the fire again, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread growing in my chest. The woods were too quiet, the night too still. Then it happened again. The rustling, the slow, deliberate movement of something large through the brush. I froze. It was closer this time. I could feel it. I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there and it was watching us. I stayed as still as possible, trying to hear anything, but all I could hear was my heartbeat in my ears. I glanced over at the others, but no one seemed to notice. They were talking, laughing. Did they not hear it? Did they not feel it? I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the nearest stick, trying to act brave. My mind raced, searching for an explanation. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was a bear or a mountain lion. But why was it staying so close to our camp? Why did it keep circling us? I walked slowly toward the edge of the clearing, hoping the animal would move on. But just as I reached the tree line, I saw it, the outline of something large moving between the trees. I froze and it froze too. We just stood there, staring at each other in the dark. Then it moved again, slowly, deliberately. My body was frozen with fear. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to make a sound. I wanted to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The silhouette of the animal was huge, taller than anything I had ever seen in these woods. My flashlight shook in my hand as I lifted it, pointing it directly at the creature. For a moment, everything went still. The beam of light illuminated the thing. Its massive body, dark fur, and glowing eyes. A mountain lion. It stared at me for what felt like an eternity, its eyes reflecting the light. Then, just as slowly as it had appeared, it turned and vanished back into the trees, disappearing as if it had never been there at all. My heart was pounding in my chest. I stayed where I was for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind was racing. What if it had been something more dangerous? Something that would have attacked us? What if it hadn't left when it did? I quickly made my way back to camp, my legs feeling like jelly, my body trembling with adrenaline. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I should tell the others or just pretend like it hadn't happened. But I couldn't shake the image of that huge, predatory animal. The rest of the night passed without incident, but none of us slept well. The morning light felt like a relief, and I couldn't wait to pack up and leave. When we finally made our way back to the car, the sense of unease didn't go away. Even as we drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see glowing eyes following us. That trip had changed something in me. It wasn't the fear of the animal or the forest itself, but the knowledge that something had been out there, so close, and that we were vulnerable. That night had been a reminder that in the wild, we were just visitors, at the mercy of the land and the creatures that roamed it. We left that campsite behind, but I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling of those eyes on me, or the sound of something heavy moving through the woods, just waiting for the right moment. And maybe that's what scared me the most, knowing that the forest, no matter how peaceful it seems, can hide things you can never fully understand. And sometimes you never see them coming. I've always enjoyed being out in nature, especially in the more remote places. My brother has worked in parks for years, and he's always had some wild stories. I haven't been able to reach him today, but when I do, I plan on calling him to share this one. It's one of those experiences you don't forget. I'm still not sure what to make of it, and the more I think about it, the more unsettled I get. It all started one crisp fall day when I was hiking with a friend of mine in northern Minnesota. It's a quiet, isolated part of the state, at least 10 miles away from any human habitation. It's the kind of place where the silence is so deep you can feel it pressing in on you. We were on a private road, walking through thick woods, with nothing but the sounds of leaves rustling underfoot and the occasional bird call breaking the stillness. I've been out here enough to know how to be safe, how to watch the ground, the trees, the sky. My companion, Sarah, is no rookie either. She's been out in the woods more times than I can count, and she's got this instinct about her, something like a sixth sense when it comes to the outdoors. She's a tracker, someone who can look at a patch of ground and tell you everything about what passed through there. I trust her judgment, especially out here, where it's so easy to get turned around or caught off guard. We were talking as we walked, nothing unusual. It's one of those peaceful moments that people long for. Just two people moving through the woods, the air crisp, the sun slipping lower in the sky. But then Sarah stopped. "Show," she whispered, holding up a hand. Her voice was low, almost a murmur. I froze, not because I was startled, but because her tone told me she'd heard something. Her eyes were scanning the trees, and I followed her gaze. The only sound I could hear was the wind moving through the branches. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I didn't hear anything at first, but then, just for a second, there was something faint, something that didn't quite belong in the usual woodland noises. A rustling, soft and deliberate. It didn't sound like an animal, but it was definitely something out of place. My heart started to pick up a little, a knot tightening in my stomach. I glanced at Sarah, and she was already moving, taking a few careful steps forward. She moved silently, like she was trying not to disturb whatever was out there. That's when I saw it. About 200 feet away, lying at the base of a tree, was a bright blaze orange jacket. It wasn't draped over a branch or hanging on a bush. It was just there, flat on the ground, as though someone had just dropped it. There were no footprints leading to it, no indication that anyone had been around it recently. No bent branches, no trampled leaves. Nothing. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. Is that someone's jacket? I asked, though I already knew the answer. It wasn't ours. It wasn't even something we'd been expecting. We called out. "Hello," I said. Nothing. The jacket just lay there, abandoned, in the middle of nowhere. Sarah moved closer and I followed her. My legs felt stiff as I walked toward it, unsure of what I was even expecting to find. There wasn't a sign of struggle. The jacket was new, like it had just been placed there. It didn't belong. That was the feeling I couldn't shake. Nothing about this scene felt right. We stood there, hovering around the jacket for a moment. "It's like it's been dropped right off the rack," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. She crouched next to it, inspecting it. I looked around again, scanning the trees for anything that seemed out of place. There was nothing but the quiet, empty woods. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and then she gasped. I turned quickly to see what had startled her. She was pointing. About 50 feet away, standing behind a tree, was a man. He was dressed in blaze orange, just like the jacket. He had a gun slung across his chest, his eyes fixed on us. He didn't move, didn't speak. His expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the intensity of his stare. I could feel my heart race in my chest. He hadn't been there a moment ago. When we were walking toward the jacket, he wasn't in sight. But now he was standing there, as if he'd materialized out of thin air. It didn't make sense. For a moment, all I could do was stare back. My brain was scrambling, trying to process what was happening. Who was this guy? Why was he out here in the middle of nowhere? And why was he watching us like that? "Sarah, let's go," I said, my voice shaky. We started backing up slowly, trying to keep the man in our line of sight. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but I knew one thing for sure: we were out of our depth. The woods here are isolated, and I've always felt safe in the sense that if something went wrong, someone would know we were out here. But not today. Today we were alone, far from anyone's reach. We didn't know where this guy had come from, and there was no telling what he was doing out there with a gun, watching us from behind that tree. I kept my eyes on him as we backed up, each step feeling heavier than the last. I felt exposed, vulnerable. When we finally reached the road, we didn't stop. We didn't even speak. We just kept walking, faster now, not daring to look back. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching us, still standing there in the trees. But I never turned around to check. When we got back to the car, we didn't waste any time getting in. I locked the doors the moment Sarah had her seatbelt on, and I started the engine, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. Neither of us said much on the drive back. We were both too shaken. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following us, but there was nothing, just the empty, lonely road behind us. Once we were back in town, I didn't know what to do. We hadn't seen the man follow us, but that didn't mean he wasn't out there watching us. We never found out who he was. We never figured out what he was doing out there, why he'd been standing there, or how he had appeared so suddenly. I tried to contact the property owner, but no one had seen anything unusual, and we never went back to that stretch of woods. I couldn't bring myself to do it. It wasn't hunting season. The man wasn't the property owner, and there were no signs of anyone else out there that day. No footprints leading to or from the jacket. Nothing. To this day, I can't explain it. I've had a lot of strange experiences in the woods, but nothing quite like that. It didn't make sense, and the feeling I had afterward, like something wasn't right, like we'd narrowly avoided something dangerous, stayed with me for a long time. I'm still not sure what happened out there. I'll never know. But I'm certain of one thing. That moment in the woods was something I'll never forget, and I'll never quite be able to shake the feeling that we were being watched. It had been a while since I'd gone camping, and when a group of friends decided to take a weekend trip into the wilderness, I agreed. We were going to set up camp by a secluded creek deep in the woods. It was the kind of place that people don't accidentally stumble upon, tucked away far enough that you had to hike in for at least 2 hours. The kind of place that promised peace and quiet, no distractions, and plenty of space to disconnect. We parked our cars at the trailhead, threw on our packs, and started the long walk in. The air was crisp and fresh, and the trees towered overhead, their branches rustling in the wind. The trail was narrow and winding, surrounded by dense undergrowth that sometimes made it hard to see the path ahead. But there was something about the walk, something that felt different from the regular city hikes I was used to. Maybe it was the silence. There weren't many birds, no sounds of animals scurrying through the brush, and no distant voices. Just the crunch of our boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The creek was cold, and the sound of water rushing over rocks was soothing. We set up our tents on a flat patch of ground beside the water, trying to be careful not to disturb the delicate balance of nature around us. I could hear the faint hum of insects in the air, and the occasional splash as a fish broke the surface of the water. We all got to work preparing dinner, gathering firewood, and setting up our small campfire. There wasn't much talking, just the normal sounds of camp life. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, like the kind of place that could make you forget the rest of the world existed. After dinner, we settled around the fire, the crackling of the wood breaking the silence that had fallen around us. The stars above were bright and sharp in the clear night sky, and the temperature had dropped, making it feel a little colder than I had expected. But it was comfortable. The fire kept the chill at bay, and the flickering light cast strange shadows on the trees surrounding us. That's when it started. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a movement in the corner of my vision, a shift in the darkness just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was the kind of thing that makes you second-guess yourself, like seeing something out of the corner of your eye and trying to rationalize it away. I shook it off at first, telling myself that it was just the wind or the shadows playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again, a figure, just at the edge of the firelight, barely visible against the dark backdrop of trees. It wasn't moving, but it was there, standing still. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but all I could see was a dark shape. It didn't seem to belong. It was like a shadow that had taken shape and just stood there, watching. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was probably just one of the others, maybe someone getting up to use the bathroom or stretch their legs. But no one said anything, and no one else seemed to notice. The rest of the group was busy talking, laughing, and tossing more wood onto the fire. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time I looked away, the figure would be there, always just out of clear view, always a little farther from the firelight, but always present. I felt my heart rate pick up, but I tried to keep calm. I got up, stretching my legs, and decided to take a walk down to the creek to get a closer look. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe I was just exhausted from the hike, and my mind was playing games with me. As I walked toward the creek, the sounds of the night surrounded me. The gurgling of the water, the occasional rustle in the trees, the distant cry of an owl. But I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me. That feeling you get when you're being observed, but when you turn around, there's nothing there. I stopped at the water's edge, taking a few deep breaths to calm myself. The moon reflected off the water, casting an eerie glow across the rocks and the surrounding trees. Then I heard it, a soft crack of a twig snapping behind me. I spun around, but again, there was nothing. No one, just the darkness of the forest stretching out in every direction. I stood there for a few moments, listening, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I told myself to calm down. It was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon. Maybe one of the other campers had gotten up and was moving around in the dark. But deep down, I didn't believe it. There was something off about this place, something that didn't sit right. I turned back to the campfire, walking quickly now. I had to tell someone, anyone. Maybe we should pack up and leave. It wasn't worth the risk. Not when I had this gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. As I neared the campsite, I saw the figure again. This time, it was closer, standing near the tree line just beyond the camp. The firelight flickered, casting distorted shadows on the figure. It looked human, but the way it stood, so still and silent, didn't feel natural. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure what to do. The fire flickered, throwing erratic light around, making the shadows dance in strange ways. I glanced back at the group, but no one had noticed. They were all too absorbed in their conversations and laughter. I didn't want to make a scene, but I also didn't want to just ignore what I was seeing. I took a deep breath and decided to approach it. If it was a person, maybe I could make out who they were, figure out what was going on. But as I moved closer, I noticed something. The figure wasn't moving. It wasn't reacting to the firelight or to my presence. It was just standing there, staring into the dark, like it was waiting for something. My pulse quickened. It wasn't right. I had to get closer, had to confirm what I was seeing. So I kept walking, keeping my steps light and quiet. As I got within a few yards of it, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was no one there. The figure was gone, vanished into the trees, as though it had never been there in the first place. But the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I wasn't sure if I should feel relieved or more terrified. I stood there for a long time, unsure of what to do. My mind raced, and my legs felt like they were frozen in place. But after what felt like an eternity, I finally turned around and made my way back to the campfire. When I returned, I didn't mention what I had seen. I didn't want to alarm anyone, especially since there was no clear explanation for it. Maybe it had been my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it had been an animal. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there, that someone or something was watching us from the shadows. The night passed uneventfully after that. We all went to bed, though I don't think any of us really slept. I stayed up for hours, lying in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. I didn't hear anything unusual, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was lurking just outside, waiting. The next morning, we packed up our things and started the hike back out. The sun had risen, casting a warm glow over the forest, and the birds had returned, filling the air with their songs. Everything seemed normal again, but as we walked out, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with us, something that hadn't left, something that had been watching us the entire time. When we got to the trailhead, I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I had learned something that night. Sometimes, the woods aren't as peaceful as they seem. Sometimes there are things out there, hidden in the shadows, that we're better off not knowing about. And maybe, just maybe, there are places in the wild that are meant to be left alone. I had always been the kind of person who enjoyed the simplicity of being out in nature, away from the noise of everyday life. It wasn't that I hated people. I just preferred the quiet, the peace, and the rhythm of the outdoors. So, when a few friends suggested a camping trip deep in the woods, I was all in. We didn't have a specific destination, just a patch of forest near a river, miles away from the nearest town. The kind of place that you wouldn't find unless you knew where to look. No signs, no marked trails, just raw, unfiltered nature. We made our way through the dense forest, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The canopy above was so dense that only slivers of light pierced through, creating a patchwork of shadow and light on the forest floor. The path was uneven, with roots and rocks poking through the dirt, making each step a little uncertain. But it was beautiful in a way that only an untouched place like this could be. We set up camp near a small stream, its gentle babbling adding to the calming atmosphere. Our tents were pitched in a loose circle around the fire pit, and the smell of burning would soon fill the air as we started to cook dinner. Everything was normal, just a few friends enjoying the woods. But that night, things started to change. It wasn't anything obvious at first. No loud noises, no sudden crashes of trees or branches breaking. It was subtle, a small change in the way the night felt. The air grew stiller, as if the forest itself had stopped breathing. I remember glancing around and noticing that the usual sounds of the forest seemed to have disappeared. The distant calls of owls, the rustle of smaller creatures in the underbrush, they were all gone. All I could hear was the crackling of our fire and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, likely from one of us shifting. We stayed up late, talking about everything and nothing. The kind of conversation that only happens in the quiet of the night when you're far from the city and the world feels miles away. But as the hours passed, I began to feel a growing unease, a sensation I couldn't quite shake. It was like being watched, but by something that wasn't obvious enough to see. You know that feeling when you're in the woods, and you're not sure if the rustling sound is a deer or something larger? That was what it felt like. I tried to ignore it, chalked it up to my imagination. But then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A branch snapping sharply, much closer than I'd expected. My heart skipped a beat. I looked over at my friends, but they didn't seem to notice. They were too busy talking, laughing, unaware of the shift in the atmosphere. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a raccoon or some other animal out looking for food. But the sound didn't stop. Came again, just a little farther to the left this time. Another crack, and then another. I got up slowly, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I walked a little distance from the campfire, trying to peer through the trees. There was nothing, just the dense forest, dark and silent. I stood there for a moment, straining my ears for any hint of movement. Nothing. When I returned to the fire, I felt better, but only a little. My friends were still chatting, their voices carrying easily in the night air. I sat back down, trying to push away the unease that had settled into my chest. But as I glanced around the edge of the clearing, I noticed something else. It was a feeling, not something you could put into words, but it was like the forest was pressing in on us, closing in tighter. The trees seemed taller in the shadows, and the night felt deeper. Then the air changed. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but enough for me to notice. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and I found myself shivering despite the warmth of the fire. I looked over at my friends, but they didn't seem to notice. They were too caught up in their conversation. I stood up again, this time walking toward the stream that ran beside our camp, thinking the sound of the water would soothe my nerves. As I walked along the bank, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the silence or the cold. It was the way everything seemed off. The stream, which had been so clear and lively earlier, now seemed almost unnaturally still, the water barely moving. The trees around the clearing were darker than I remembered, their shadows stretching longer than they should have been. My skin crawled. I turned to head back to camp, but before I could make it back to the fire, I heard it again. A sound this time closer. A low, grating noise, like something dragging across the ground. I froze, my heart pounding. My eyes darted around, trying to catch any movement in the dark. Then I saw it. A figure, a shape moving just beyond the edge of the trees. At first, it was just a blur, but then it became clearer. A large silhouette crouched low to the ground. It moved with unnatural speed, almost slithering, as if it was trying to stay hidden. I stood there, unable to move, staring at the shadowed figure. It paused for a moment, and then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished back into the trees. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step back, nearly stumbling over a rock in my haste to return to the camp. When I made it back to the fire, I was panting, my heart racing. My friends looked up, surprised by my sudden return, but I said nothing. I didn't want to alarm them. I tried to act normal, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the image of that figure, moving so unnaturally fast, slipping in and out of the trees like it was part of the darkness itself. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I don't know if anyone else noticed the tension, but I couldn't relax. I kept checking the trees, scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. The night seemed to stretch on forever, each second weighed down by an unseen presence. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I lay down in my tent. I tried to sleep, but every noise outside made my heart skip a beat. I kept hearing things in the dark, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. But when I would listen closer, the sounds would stop, leaving only the eerie quiet of the forest. Morning came, and with it a strange relief. The sun's light broke through the trees, warming the cold air and washing away some of the tension that had built up overnight. My friends and I packed up camp, ready to head back home, and the woods that had seemed so unsettling the night before now felt just like any other forest. As we made our way back down the trail, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder one last time, half expecting to see that figure in the distance. But there was nothing, just the quiet of the forest, the sound of our footsteps crunching through the dry leaves. By the time we reached the parking lot, I had almost convinced myself it was all in my head, just the product of too much silence and too many hours in the dark. But when we got into the car and started driving back to civilization, I glanced out the window one last time, and for a brief moment, just at the edge of the trees, I saw something move, a figure, tall and dark, standing perfectly still in the shadows. I didn't say anything. I just looked away, staring straight ahead as we drove off. But I couldn't shake the feeling that, whatever it was still watching us, waiting. And that thought stayed with me long after we had left the woods behind. I had never been to Australia before, let alone to the wilderness in the snowy mountains. It was Easter, and I had been visiting a school in Canberra. My host mom, who was an avid hiker, decided to take me on a 4-day trek through the mountains. It sounded like an adventure, so I agreed, even though I was a bit nervous. I'd never done anything quite like this before. We were joined by a friend of mine, a teacher from the school, and his wife. We started at Selwyn Snowfield, a few hours outside of Canberra. After that, it felt like we were leaving civilization behind. We didn't plan to walk too far the first day, just enough to get settled into the wilderness. The first day was a short 7 to 8 kilometers hike, so we weren't exhausted, but the landscape was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The trail took us deep into the mountains, and as we walked, I felt more and more isolated. No other people, no sounds from the city, just the wind and the crunch of snow under our boots. By the time we set up camp, it was already late afternoon. We managed to get a fire going just before it got dark. The flames flickered in the chilly air, casting long shadows on the surrounding trees. We sat around the fire, cooking our food and sharing stories, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of the place. The cold air made everything feel fresh, and the stars in the sky were so bright, it felt like they were within arm's reach. I was far from home, in a place where I didn't know what to expect, but still I felt oddly calm. We didn't stay up too late. It had been a long day, and everyone was tired. By around 10 or 11 o'clock, we decided to go to bed. My tent was set up just off the trail, about 10 meters from where the fire was still burning low. We had considered setting up directly on the trail itself because the ground there was more even, but we ultimately decided to stay just off it, finding a spot that felt a little more sheltered by the trees. The first night in the wilderness was strange for me. As I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to fall asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling of being far away from everything familiar. The silence of the mountains felt heavy, almost suffocating. Just as I started to doze off, I heard something. At first, it was so faint, I thought it was just the wind. It sounded like a low humming noise, far off in the distance. I strained my ears, wondering if I was imagining it, but then the sound became clearer. It was a car coming up the trail. I froze, couldn't believe it. We were so far away from civilization, deep into the mountains, and yet there was a vehicle. My mind raced, trying to figure out who could possibly be out here in the middle of nowhere. I stayed perfectly still in my tent, barely breathing, listening as the sound of the car grew louder. The humming became a low rumble, the unmistakable sound of an engine. The vehicle must have been very close now. I could hear the tires crunching on the dirt trail, and then the light from the headlights shone right through my tent. It was so bright, I could see the outline of the tent fabric, and I felt like the vehicle was right on top of me. My heart raced. I couldn't understand how someone could be driving here, especially this late at night. The trail was not open to the public, and as far as I knew, cars weren't allowed on it. It must have been a park ranger or maybe a dog trapper, but the idea of someone being out here, in the middle of nowhere, made me feel a strange sense of unease. I didn't dare move. The car passed by just a meter from my tent. I held my breath, praying that whoever it was wouldn't stop. After what felt like an eternity, the car's headlights disappeared, and the sound of the engine faded away into the night. I let out a slow breath, feeling my heart thudding in my chest. I was glad we hadn't set up on the trail after all. If we had, I would have had to scramble to move my tent in the dark so the car could pass. It was strange, though. Who would be out there in the dark on that trail? My mind kept running through different possibilities, but I never came up with an answer. I finally managed to fall asleep, but the encounter lingered in the back of my mind. The next few days passed with little incident. The hiking was beautiful, and we made steady progress through the mountains. The landscape was stunning. Snow-capped peaks, lush valleys, and crystal-clear streams. It was everything I imagined the Australian wilderness would be. The air was crisp and clean, and I could feel the weight of the silence around us. On the second day, we walked through more isolated areas, deeper into the mountains. We stopped in the afternoon at a picturesque valley that seemed like the perfect place to set up camp. Some of the group members thought we should stop there, but I suggested we continue on for a bit longer and get out of the valley. I had a feeling we needed to move on, though I couldn't explain why. After a brief discussion, we decided to push forward for another half hour. We made it to the top of a hill and set up camp near a stream. The valley below was beautiful, but the setting on the hill felt a bit safer. We built the fire, cooked our meals, and spent the evening watching the stars. There was a clear sky, and we could see airplanes and satellites passing overhead. It was peaceful, almost surreal. As the night wore on, we grew tired and started talking about heading to bed. But just as we were about to call it a night, we heard something, distant at first, then louder as it carried on the wind. Dogs were howling. It was strange because we hadn't seen any dogs on the trail, and it didn't sound like anything familiar. The howls were deep and haunting, echoing across the valley we had just left. The sound made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. At first, it was just a single howl, and then another and another until there were several of them. The howling continued for what felt like an eternity, 30 minutes, maybe longer. It was unsettling, especially since we had just been in that valley, and it felt like the dogs were calling out to us, or maybe to something else in the mountains. I tried to ignore the sound, but it was hard to shake off the feeling of unease. I couldn't help but wonder what had caused the howling. The dogs didn't sound wild, and they didn't sound like any animals I was familiar with. Maybe they were wild dogs, but the howl wasn't quite right. It didn't help that we had been out in the middle of nowhere for so long, away from any help or safety. The wilderness felt vast and indifferent to us, and that was a feeling I couldn't escape. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. I kept hearing the howls in my mind, the eerie sound drifting in from the valley. It wasn't the noise itself that bothered me. It was the uncertainty of it. I had no idea what had made that sound. And after the car encounter on the first night, my mind was racing with possibilities. I wondered if the dogs were related to whoever had been on the trail the night before. Maybe they were part of something we didn't understand. The night passed slowly. The fire eventually died down, and the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional crack of a twig. I lay awake in my tent, listening for anything else that might disturb the silence. The howling finally stopped, and with it, my nerves started to settle. But I still didn't sleep well. The next morning, the sun came up, and the forest seemed different, more peaceful, but somehow more haunting too. It was as if the wilderness had a mind of its own, and we were just visitors in its domain. We packed up and started walking again, heading further into the mountains. The strange happenings didn't seem as frightening in the daylight, but they lingered in my mind. We finished our hike a couple of days later, and though I was glad to be back in civilization, part of me missed the raw beauty of the mountains. I still don't know what made the car pass by our campsite or the dogs howl from the valley, but both events left me with a feeling of unease that I couldn't shake. Looking back, the whole experience was a reminder of how small we are in the face of nature. The wilderness is vast, and no matter how prepared we are, it can be unsettling, even dangerous. I never found an explanation for what I experienced in the snowy mountains, but it's something that will stay with me for a long time. The isolation, the odd encounters, and the strange noises all seem to point to one thing. Sometimes the wilderness doesn't give you answers. You just have to accept that some things are beyond understanding. and that's what makes it both beautiful and terrifying. I'm out camping with a group of friends in the middle of nowhere on Crown Land in Alberta, Canada. If you're not familiar with it, Crown Land is essentially public land, pretty much free for anyone to use, and it's just beautiful and raw. Lots of forest, lakes, and wildlife, about as untouched as you can get. There's a catch though, and that's the lack of any rules or regulations. It's great for freedom, but if you're like me, you've seen some sketchy stuff out here before. Weird people, weird noises in the night, and some spots where you just get that uncomfortable feeling that you're not really alone, even if there's no one around. But that's the risk of camping out here, right? This time, we were up in the forested area, trying to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life. It's mid-August, and that means one thing around here: fire bans. The forest is bone dry from the heat, and the last thing anyone wants is to start a wildfire, so there's a total fire ban. That means no campfires, no cooking over an open flame, nothing. The only thing we've got is a single lantern, barely enough to light the area around our campsite. No fire smoke means the bugs are especially bad, and that's saying something because Alberta's mosquitoes are known for being relentless. I'm slapping away mosquitoes left and right, trying not to let it ruin the whole experience. The night is thick with the sounds of insects and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the trees. I've been camping my whole life, and I've seen my fair share of dangerous animals. Bears, wolves, even cougars, but tonight it's just the usual forest sounds. At least, that's what I'm telling myself. We've got a good group of people here, about 6 of us. Most of them are around the camp, sharing stories, cracking open beers, and generally making noise by the one lantern we brought. Everyone's in high spirits, but I'm starting to feel that need for some space. You know that feeling? When you've been around people too long and just need to step away for a minute. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's like my brain just wants a breather. So I decide to go off on my own for a bit. The group doesn't seem to mind, and honestly, it's a relief. I walk away from the camp, heading into the forest. The air is thick with moisture, and the forest smells of pine and dirt. I know the area well enough by now. Spent a lot of time out here over the years. It's about a 10-minute walk to get far enough away from the camp where I can do my business without feeling like I'm being watched. It's nice to just be alone. The quiet broken only by the sound of my boots crunching over the forest floor. I find a decent spot behind some thick underbrush, a little way off the path I walked in on, and squat down. The air is cool against my skin, and the only thing I can hear is the quiet of the forest, with the occasional distant sound of someone laughing back at camp. I'm concentrating on my surroundings, listening for any movement nearby. Out here, you never know when an animal might wander too close. And that's when it happens. Something furry touches my ass. I can't describe it any other way. There's a sudden brush of something against my skin, a fast and unexpected movement that sends a jolt of panic through me. I scream loud. I can't help it. I scramble to pull my pants up. The sudden shock of whatever it was brushing against me so unexpected that my mind can't make sense of it. I'm running, stumbling, tripping over roots, trying to get back to camp as fast as possible. My heart is pounding in my chest, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was is still right behind me, lurking in the darkness. The sound of my breath is sharp in the night air as I run, and I'm sure I'm making a hell of a racket. The lantern light flickers faintly in the distance as I race back to camp. When I finally burst back into the clearing, I must look like a mess. My face is flushed, my hair tangled from running, and I'm panting like I've just sprinted a marathon. My husband, who's sitting by the lantern, immediately looks up, a mix of confusion and amusement in his eyes. He's used to my overreactions, so he probably thinks I'm just being dramatic. "Jesus, what happened?" he asks, sounding half bored and half curious. "There's something out there," I say, breathless. I don't know what it was, but it was furry. It brushed against me. He looks at me for a moment, his expression going from confused to skeptical. "Furry? Yeah, it was like something brushed up against me." I explain, trying to calm down, but the adrenaline is still running high. "You need to go check it out." He chuckles. "You're probably just freaking out. I'll take the lantern and go see." At this point, I don't care if I sound like an idiot. I'm terrified. Whatever it was too fast, and it made me feel like I wasn't the only one out there. I watch him grab the lantern and head off in the direction I came from, his footsteps soft on the forest floor. He's trying to calm me down, telling me it's probably nothing. But in the pit of my stomach, I know something's wrong. There's a strange tension in the air, something I can't explain. I stand by the camp, watching the shadows stretch across the trees, waiting for him to come back. Takes him longer than I expect. I start pacing back and forth, wondering if maybe he's found something. And then, just as I'm starting to feel the knot in my stomach loosen a little, I hear his voice calling back from the forest. "I found something," he says, sounding strange, almost confused. "You're not going to believe this." I rush toward him, heart skipping a beat. I'm half expecting to see a bear or some other large animal, but instead, what I find stops me dead in my tracks. He's holding up a leg, a deer leg. It's not fresh, but it's definitely not old enough to be a skeleton, either. I can't quite tell the state it's in, half rotted, but still fleshy enough to be disturbing. He holds up another leg, then a third. The pieces all seem to be scattered around the area I'd been squatting in. The whole damn thing is jumbled up. It's as though someone had field-dressed the deer a while ago and just left the parts here. It's not the kind of thing I want to find while I'm out in the forest alone at night. I stand there in shock, looking at the legs, the fur still clinging to the pieces. A sick realization hits me. It's a deer someone had shot and butchered last fall, and I had just squatted right on top of it. The thought makes me sick. My heart is still racing, but now it's from disgust rather than fear. I can't believe this is what I freaked out over. "You've got to be kidding me," I mutter, unable to tear my eyes away from the gruesome sight. I'm repulsed, but it's also kind of funny in a dark way. I have no idea what the hell someone would be doing with the legs of a deer out here, but this isn't what I expected. To get back at whoever left this mess, I decide to pee on it. I'm not proud of it, but in the moment, it felt like the only thing I could do. I squat down again, this time with a clear target. And when I'm done, I feel a little better. It's my way of reclaiming some control over a situation that terrified me for no good reason. We end up packing up and leaving a lot sooner than planned. The atmosphere around camp just doesn't feel right anymore. It's not even about the deer legs anymore. It's the feeling that we're not alone, that something is just off. As we load up the truck, I look back at the dark forest behind us. The trees seem to whisper, and I can't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us the whole time. Whatever it was, I hope it stays out there in the woods. I don't think I'll be camping that far out on Crown land again anytime soon. I hadn't planned on going camping that weekend, but my friends insisted. It was supposed to be a quick getaway, just a couple of days out in the woods. We were going to stay at a small, secluded campsite far from the usual crowd, deep in the forest where the trails were thin and the trees so thick, they barely let any sunlight through. It sounded like the perfect escape. What I didn't expect, though, was how fast things would get unsettling. We set up camp in the late afternoon, our tents lined up in a neat row near a creek that whispered against the rocks. The air was cool, the sky clear, and the forest around us was still, almost too still. I'd been to the woods before a few times, but this place felt different. Maybe it was because we were so far from the nearest road, or the fact that there were no other campers in sight. Just us and the wilderness. The night fell quickly, and soon, we were sitting around a fire, laughing, joking, and talking about everything and nothing. It was the kind of night you'd expect when you're out with friends, away from all the chaos of daily life. But as the darkness grew deeper, I began to feel a strange tightness in my chest. It wasn't fear exactly, but more like a sense of being watched, something I couldn't quite shake off. I tried to ignore it and kept my eyes focused on the fire. Around 10 p.m., the air grew colder, and the sounds of the forest started to change. It was subtle at first, the rustle of leaves here and there, the snap of twigs breaking. Nothing that would make you jump, but just enough to put you on edge. We all noticed it, but no one said anything. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the camp, making the trees seem like they were moving with every breeze. I was sitting closest to the edge of the camp, near the creek, when I heard it. A low thud. It was faint, almost lost in the wind, but it was definitely there. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see one of my friends getting up to grab something, but everyone was still around the fire. I shrugged it off. Could have been a bear, or a deer, or just the forest settling in for the night. I tried to go back to the conversation, but the sound came again, a little closer this time. Hud hud hud. My pulse quickened, and I stood up, not knowing exactly why. I could see the others in my peripheral vision, oblivious to the noise. I took a few cautious steps toward the woods, towards the direction where the sound was coming from. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a deer. It sounded deliberate and heavy. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The noise had stopped, but now I could hear something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on the leaves, moving across the forest floor. It was unmistakable now. There was something out there, moving, watching. I froze. I couldn't move, not sure whether I should go back to the campfire or stay put. My eyes scanned the tree line, trying to make out any movement. The moonlight barely pierced through the thick canopy of leaves above, but I thought I saw a shape, tall and dark, silhouetted against the forest. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a deer. It looked like a person, but it couldn't have been. We were the only ones out here. My heart began to pound in my chest. I slowly turned back to the camp, considering running for it, but the thought of leaving everyone behind made my stomach churn. I couldn't just vanish. I needed to get back to the group. I took one step backward, then another, my eyes still glued to the spot where I had seen the figure. But as I reached the campfire, I realized something. The footsteps had stopped. There was nothing but the sound of the creek and the faint whisper of the wind. I tried to push the feeling of dread down, focusing on the warmth of the fire, the voices of my friends, but the unease wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right. The night wore on, and I stayed closer to the fire, feeling the heat on my face, but my mind kept drifting back to the figure I'd seen, or thought I saw at the edge of the trees. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle in the leaves, made my skin prickle with anticipation. The others seemed perfectly comfortable, too comfortable. Maybe they hadn't heard what I had. Around midnight, one of my friends, Lucas, suggested we go for a walk. I didn't want to go, but I didn't want to seem scared either. So I agreed, telling myself I was just being paranoid. We left the warmth of the fire behind and started walking along the trail that wound through the trees. The path was narrow, and the forest around us was dense, but the moonlight was enough to guide us. We were maybe 5 minutes into the walk when Lucas stopped, suddenly stiff. I felt my pulse race again. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, barely able to breathe. The sound was unmistakable. The crunch of leaves, the snap of branches, and then the unmistakable shuffle of something heavy moving just off the trail. We both stood still, holding our breath, listening. A shadow passed between the trees, moving too quickly, too silently. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. I couldn't even tell what it was. I could only see the outline of something large moving through the woods. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen. Then we heard the footsteps again, closer this time, and I felt my heart in my throat. Whatever it was coming for us. Without thinking, I grabbed Lucas's arm, pulling him back toward the camp. We ran. The brush and undergrowth slowed us down, and I could hear the sound of something following us, matching our pace. It wasn't a human sound, too heavy, too uneven. I don't know how long we ran, but when we finally made it back to the camp, the others were already standing up, looking around, aware that something was off. We didn't have to say a word. Everyone could feel it. We weren't alone. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed by the fire, staring into the dark woods, every crackling branch, every gust of wind, making us flinch. And as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, we finally felt safe enough to start packing up, silently, without speaking much. We weren't going to wait around to find out who or what was out there in the woods with us. We left early, driving back through the winding roads with the sun rising behind us. None of us spoke about it, but we all knew something had been there, something that had been watching us. The woods had felt too quiet, too alive with things we couldn't see, and the unease stayed with me, creeping into the back of my mind whenever I was alone. It wasn't until later that I found out the area we had been camping in was known for sightings of people going missing. No answers, no traces. I'll never know what exactly was out there that night, but the fear I felt, the chill that never left me, made me certain it wasn't just my imagination. Whatever it was, it had been watching us, and we'd left. I'll never forget that hike. It was the summer of 2006, and my friend Kyle and I had decided to take a few days off from our usual routine to trek through the Jemez Mountains in northern New Mexico. The plan was simple: get away from civilization, explore the backcountry, and have a few quiet days camping by the hot springs that were tucked away deep in the canyons. We'd been hiking for hours, a little over 8 by the time we were rounding a bend in the trail, following a narrow path that hugged the edge of a steep canyon. The air was thick with the earthy scent of pine and dust. The distant call of birds echoed off the jagged rock walls. It was one of those afternoons where the sun hangs low and the shadows stretch long, but the temperature is still warm enough that you barely feel the cool breeze in the air. Then we saw him. At first, we thought it was just another hiker, maybe an older guy who had wandered off trail, or a local who knew the area better than we did. He was sitting on a weathered tree stump, about 25 feet away, with his back to us. A backpack lay beside him, half open, the straps hanging loosely. His clothes were torn, dirty, covered in dust and streaked with something darker that looked like old mud. I don't know why, but something about him made my stomach twist. It wasn't just that he looked out of place. It was the way he sat there, still and quiet, as though he was waiting for something, or someone. At first, we hesitated, unsure whether to approach him. I mean, here we were, deep in the backcountry with no one around for miles. The idea of encountering someone out here, especially someone who didn't seem like they belonged, was unsettling. But Kyle, who had always been the more outgoing of the two of us, took a step forward and waved. "Hey!" he called out, his voice bouncing off the canyon walls. The man slowly turned his head, his eyes cold and unreadable. For a moment, he just stared at us, his face partially obscured by a thick, unkempt beard and long, greasy hair. His expression was strange, almost like he didn't recognize what we were, or perhaps didn't care. "Afternoon," he said, his voice rough, gravelly, but not unfriendly. We exchanged a few pleasantries, nothing too serious. He mentioned the weather, how it had been drier than usual that summer, and how the hot spring was a few miles further down the canyon. We briefly discussed the area, the hiking trails, and the beauty of the landscape around us. I can't say why, but his presence made me uneasy the whole time. There was something off about the way he spoke, his tone too casual for the remote wilderness we were in. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he stood up. Without another word, he picked up his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and disappeared into the trees, vanishing into the dense thicket just beyond the trail. Kyle and I stood there, frozen for a moment, both of us trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Was that weird to you?" Kyle asked, his voice low. "Yeah, a little," I replied, watching the trees where the man had vanished. I wasn't sure why, but something about the encounter felt off, like we had just crossed paths with someone who wasn't supposed to be out there. We both reached into our packs and pulled out the small piece of paper we'd been given at the trailhead. A wanted poster. We'd seen them all over the small towns near the mountains. They had been stapled to telephone poles, bulletin boards, and tucked inside local shops, warning anyone who planned on hiking or camping in the area about the Cookie Bandit. The name was odd, but it had a chilling undertone. The Cookie Bandit had been described as a drifter, someone who had been sneaking into remote cabins, stealing food, gear, and firearms. His face wasn't clear in the photos, and there were very few details about him, other than the fact that he was believed to be dangerous. As we stared at the sketch of the suspect, we exchanged glances. "That guy," Kyle muttered, He looks exactly like the sketch. I had to agree. The man we just encountered, the one who had been sitting there in the shade of the trees, his features were strikingly similar to the rough sketch on the poster. The beard, the eyes, the general build, it all lined up. And suddenly, it all made sense. That uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at me, the strange disconnection in his voice, his sudden departure. He was the cookie bandit, or at least he matched the description. We didn't waste any time. The moment he was out of sight, we packed up our things and turned around. It was a tough decision to make, but we knew what we had to do. We were too far from help to risk anything, and we had no idea if the man had seen us as a threat or not. The sheriff's office was about 45 minutes away by car, so we booked it back to our starting point as quickly as we could. The rest of the hike felt like a blur, a rush of adrenaline making the trees and rocks around us seem like they were closing in. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush had us on edge. We didn't see the man again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was somewhere out there, watching us. When we finally reached the sheriff's office, we showed them the wanted poster and described the encounter. The deputies seemed skeptical at first, but after a few minutes, they went into action, sending out a couple of patrols into the mountains. They had received reports of strange activity before, but nothing concrete had ever been found. Unfortunately, they were never able to locate him. We spent the night in town, nervous but relieved to be out of the backcountry. I'd like to say that the story ends there, but it doesn't. 3 years later, the man we'd encountered was found holed up in a cabin, surrounded by deputies. A shootout followed, and both the suspect and one of the officers were killed. The man's identity was confirmed: Joseph Henry Burgess, the notorious cookie bandit, and a wanted fugitive with a bloody past. He had been linked to a series of brutal murders stretching across the Pacific Northwest, California, and the Southwest, dating back to the 1970s. Burgess was not just some petty criminal, he was a serial killer, and we had unknowingly crossed paths with him that day in the mountains. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The man who had casually talked to us about hot springs and weather was a murderer, someone capable of unspeakable violence. But in that moment, I couldn't help but think about how close we had come to a much darker encounter, how easily he could have turned on us in the wilderness, and how we had somehow escaped without a scratch. For a long time after that, I couldn't shake the feeling of his cold eyes on me, even when I wasn't thinking about him. I still wonder what would have happened if we hadn't turned back when we did. What if we had stayed in the canyon just a little longer, wandered a little farther, or been in a different place at the wrong time? I still don't know the answers, but I'm thankful for the sheriff's office that night. They couldn't find him then, but they eventually got him. The experience changed how I think about the wilderness. It's a beautiful, unforgiving place, but it's not always the wildlife you have to watch out for. Sometimes, it's the people who are hiding in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity. We were heading to the tree line to grab some firewood. It was just me, my dad, and my grandfather, who always had this way about him, like the woods were his domain. He'd been here longer than most of the trees, it seemed. Dad had told me stories of when he was my age, camping out with his father, grandfather, and how his grandfather, our grandpa, would chase off bears with a pitchfork. Not that I doubted him, but as a kid, you just kind of file that away under grandpa stories, you know? But it was all real to Dad. He'd seen it happen more than once. The night we went for firewood, I didn't expect anything to happen, like you don't when you're out there in the deep woods. There's always something a little eerie when you're miles away from any light. The stars up above looked brighter than they had a right to be, and the air was crisp with that scent of damp pine. We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes, flashlights bouncing off trees and brush, when Dad first saw something. His voice went quiet, like it always did when something felt wrong. "Did you see that?" I froze, looking where he was pointing, but there was nothing but trees and the shadow of night. And then I saw it. A flicker, just a small glint of light, like eyes catching the flashlight beam. It was high up, real high. I don't know how high exactly, but it was like looking up at a big tree branch or something. But there weren't any trees that tall around us. At first, I thought it was a bear. It wasn't uncommon in that area. They were all over. We had seen them close to the house before, and I knew how to stay calm around them. But this felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling. And then it moved. Not the kind of movement you expect from a bear either. More like something just watching. My dad's hand went to his side, where he kept a gun, but he didn't pull it out right away. He was waiting. I don't think he knew what he was dealing with, but he knew it wasn't just a bear. We both stood there in silence, listening to the way the thing shifted. The sound didn't come from the ground, like a bear would, but from the height. The height that just didn't add up. Maybe 12 feet off the ground, maybe higher. I don't know. All I could think was that it was big. Bigger than anything I'd ever seen in those woods. The air around it started to feel heavy. There was this smell that hit me. A stench so awful that I gagged a little. Like rot. Like death. A sharp, putrid odor that I couldn't shake. Then my grandfather, who up until that point had been walking quietly behind us, stopped dead in his tracks. He raised the old shotgun he carried with him. I watched the barrel swing toward the direction of the thing. It didn't flinch. Grandpa pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot cracked through the quiet woods, and for a second, I thought that would be it. That whatever it was would run off, scared like the bears did. But it didn't. The thing just stood there, didn't even flinch. That's when I felt it. That cold, creeping sensation at the back of my neck. I was waiting for something else to happen, for some animal to break out of the woods, charging us. But that's when it did something I can't forget. It roared. First, I thought it was just a bear, but then I heard it again. This roar was unlike any animal I had ever heard. It was a mix of something wild, something powerful, but it wasn't just the roar of an animal. No, it was like a lion's roar, but at the same time, there was something else in it. A scream, a woman's scream almost. It was like a cry for help, but it was so distorted. I could barely breathe, and the worst part, the head never moved, stayed still. It just stood there, frozen, as if it was waiting for something. I don't know what. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, the adrenaline kicking in. Grandpa was shaking. I'd never seen him like this. He chased off bears. He had dealt with every kind of danger the woods could throw at him, but this was something different. His hands were trembling as he held that gun. And then his voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. Run. At first, I didn't hear him. I thought I was imagining it. His voice was so shaky, so choked with fear that I almost didn't understand the words. He said it again. Run now. Dad didn't wait. We turned and ran. It didn't matter that we were a mile from the house. It didn't matter how dark it was, how much the trees crowded around us, how fast my heart was pounding in my chest. All that mattered was getting away. I could hear Grandpa's heavy footsteps behind us, the sound of his boots crunching through the underbrush as he moved faster than I thought he could. He was 70, maybe a little older, and here he was, running like a man half his age, the fear in his eyes pushing him forward. We didn't stop until we made it back to the house. My dad was panting, his face pale, and I could see that he was as shaken as I was. We didn't talk much that night. Grandpa sat down on the porch and stared out into the woods, his face as white as a sheet. He was shaking too. He didn't say a word, just sat there in silence. We heard the howl again about an hour later. It wasn't close, but it was close enough to remind us that whatever it was wasn't far off. It sounded like that same mix of roar and scream, carried on the wind. And it was enough. Enough that none of us even thought about going back out there. That night, we stayed inside, windows shut, the door locked. The fire crackled in the hearth, but there was an unsettling stillness in the house. We all knew something was out there, something we couldn't explain. We didn't camp out there again. And my dad, who never liked to talk much about the woods, never did. I think he thought if he stayed quiet, if he didn't bring it up, it would just fade into the background. But it didn't. Not for him. Not for me. There was no explanation for what we saw that night. No way to explain the smell or the roar. There wasn't a bear that big. There wasn't anything that could stand that high off the ground without the whole woods knowing about it. Grandpa knew it too, which was why he never spoke of it again. He knew that whatever we had encountered wasn't something you talked about. So we left, and the woods stayed just as quiet as they always were, with secrets deep in the shadows.